went to a conference at that time. The oil price was around $30. And the leading expert on energy in the US, who had written several books on energy already in the 80s. In the 80s, he had predicted that oil prices would go up forever. It then collapsed to $12 in the mid-80s. By the time oil was at $30, his view was that it would collapse to $15. Interestingly enough, in March of this year, when oil went to $145, he predicted it would go to $200. So it was a very clear sell signal. But the issue here is really, as China's appetite for commodities increased, they drove up prices, and you can see that, say, the expenditures of the US and of Asia, the combined expenditure for oil, went from $150 billion annually to over $1.5 trillion. And that, of course, had a huge impact on the resource-producing nations, because it was not only oil that China drove up, but also iron ore and copper and nickel and so forth. And that meant a huge change in the fortunes of these countries. Suddenly they were flushed with liquidity, and there was a boom, and that was a huge change, because if you consider 1980 to 2001, commodity prices went down. So what the resource producers of the world were selling was deflating, was going down in price, but what they were buying was still appreciating, not substantially, but we still had consumer price inflation in the world. So the terms of trade were deteriorating. Now suddenly they are flushed with money, and so the Russians and the OPEC countries and the African oil producers and also other resource producers in the world like Australia, they went into a shopping trip, and they bought luxury goods from Europe and capital goods from Europe and from Japan. And that lifted the economies in Europe and in Japan, and through the price increases in commodities in the resource-producing countries of the world. And so we had a synchronized global boom. This is unusual in the history of capitalism, that the whole world is in boom conditions. If you traveled a year ago around the world, there was a boom in every city. From Dubai to Europe, to the United States, to Latin America, to Australia, to Asia, everywhere you had boom conditions. That is unusual because, let's say, in the 200 years history of capitalism, the 151st year were a system of colonialism, and then you never had synchronized global growth because the industrialized countries of the West did not have as an objective to boost the economic growth rates of poor countries. And then following the breakdown of colonialism with and after the Second World War, you essentially had 40% of the world's population under communism and socialism. And you should very well know that the objective of these governments was not to boost personal consumption. And then when communism begins to break down in 1978 with China's open door policy, China was still a small economy. And as I mentioned earlier, commodity prices began to collapse after 1980. And by the way, in real terms, commodities had already peaked out in 1974, inflation adjusted. So again, no synchronized boom. Then when the commodity producers kind of bottomed out at the end of the 1980s,